Hi, I'm Leo Spiegel, proud alumni. I graduated in 1983. I'm kind of a crazy startup person. I've done over 60 startups and had 30 exits, and I just am a glutton for punishment. I love building companies. When I was in undergrad, I went to some pretty amazing professors, one in fact who got the Nobel Prize in economics, Clive Granger, and I told him that I thought his life's work was wrong and that the stock market wasn't random. And as opposed to, looking, offended, he loved it. And he encouraged me, and he basically paired me up with Professor Attia. The great thing they did is they said, look, we're up here in this ivory tower. You need to go to where people actually trade. And to get credit, we want you to do an internship. So I did an internship down in La Jolla at Beige Halsey Stewart Shields. But more importantly, what was happening during that time is that all these brokers were buying computers, and they didn't really have any software. And I was a starving college student, so I started programming those computers to do things, and that's what really started my career.
I think what makes Leo successful is that he's truly interested in the companies. What drives him is building those companies and helping people launch their careers.
Making a startup thrive, for me, it really comes down to three things. Number one, the most important thing are the people. You need to have the right skill sets, but also people who have the right temperament. The second thing is you have to have a differentiated product. You really need to have a product that creates value for the customer, and that value needs to be measurable. And then lastly, you need capital. Cash is like oxygen to a startup, and without it, you die. And so having the right funding strategy, having the right investors, those are really the secrets, I think, to building a successful startup. For current students who are passionate about entrepreneurship, what I would really encourage you to do is to follow your dreams. If you're lucky enough to have a great idea that you can get funded, you should go for it. If you don't have a great idea, get involved in a startup. Get your hands dirty. Because the great thing about startups is titles don't really matter. Anybody can contribute in any way, and a great startup will acknowledge that and encourage it. You just have to get in and start, and then doors open.
Leo has been part of the Rady School since the very beginning, supporting us financially with our building, with our entrepreneurship center, supporting our students.
I always think, like in a business, at the end of the day, what matters is the products you create and the value you create for your shareholders. UC San Diego is creating great products, both in terms of technologies, but most importantly in terms of the students who leave here and who do amazing things in their lives.
Congratulations, Leo, for winning the Illustrious Alumni Award. You more than deserve it.